and that the nation in question will seek the extradition of that individual if she or he is apprehended. Loosely speaking, these are Interpol's wanted notices, but that's an inaccurate way of putting it. In reality, these are national wanted notices that, at the request of an NCB, Interpol puts on its board. The time it takes for Interpol to do this depends on the circumstances, but a red notice can be requested and posted in as little as 2 hours. In about half of Interpol's member nations, a red notice is the legal equivalent of a domestic arrest warrant. In other words, if you're subject to a red notice and you're in one of these nations, you can and you will be arrested on the strength of the red notice alone. It's not easy to evade a red notice, as an increasing number of nations scan your passport against various Interpol databases when you arrive at passport control. But importantly, no nation is compelled by membership in Interpol to take any action at all on the basis of any request made through Interpol. Nations that choose to treat Interpol notices as arrest warrants do this on a voluntary basis. All nations in Interpol remain entirely sovereign and participate in Interpol on a basis of sovereign equality. Second, Interpol transmits what are known as diffusions. These are electronic communications between Interpol's member nations using Interpol's systems. The advantage of a diffusion is that they are private. They are not available to the public. Red notices, by contrast, must be sent to all of Interpol's member nations. Now, of course, as noted on the handout, one member nation can also communicate directly with another member nation using an email system, and naturally, nations can and do talk to each other outside Interpol. The advantage of Interpol is that it's a structured, formal system. Interpol was founded in 1923, but was essentially reborn after 1945. Almost immediately became involved in a controversy about the political abuse of its systems when, in 1950, Czechoslovakian dissidents hijacked a plane and flew to West Germany, whereupon Interpol put out, at the request of the Czechoslovakian government, a red notice on the dissidents. As a result, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover ordered the FBI to withdraw from Interpol's predecessor organization, the International Criminal Police Commission. The loss of U.S. membership was a disaster, and as a result, the Commission adopted a new constitution and the name of Interpol in 1956. The 1956 Constitution was significant in particular because of its Article 3, which forbids Interpol from, quote, undertaking any intervention or activities of a political, military, religious, or racial character, unquote. In other words, Interpol is supposed to be exclusively concerned with common law crimes, offenses recognized by all civilized societies. This distinction between common law crimes and political crimes is fundamentally important to Interpol, for the simple reason that unless all of Interpol's member nations agree to keep politics out of it, the organization will fall apart, just as it almost did after 1950. The problem, of course, is entirely effective. First, all Interpol member nations are bound to comply with Interpol's constitution and its rules on the processing of data. Second, when requesting a red notice, Interpol member nations must state that a valid arrest warrant exists for the named individual. Third, at least in theory, Interpol reviews all requests for a red notice for compliance with Interpol's rules before issuing a notice. Fourth, notices can be challenged in various ways by NCBs and individuals, most notably through the CCF, the Commission for the Control of Interpol's Files. So it wouldn't be fair to say that Interpol has done nothing to limit the possibility for abuse. Unfortunately, in my view, all of these measures are inadequate. One reason is that for many years, Interpol worked through a paper system. But as Interpol commendably modernized its communications in ways that made requesting a red notice easier, the number of notices requested and issued skyrocketed. In 1998, for example, Interpol issued fewer than 1,000 red notices. By 2011, it was issuing almost 8,000 annually. The number of diffusions jumped from under 2,000 in the year 2000 to over 15,000 by the year 2011. The old paper-based system, by its sheer inefficiency, offered some protection against abuse. The new electronic system, entirely unintentionally, actually facilitates abuse. Many of you, particularly in this audience, will be familiar with Herzen's prophecy from the 1950s that what he feared, the 1850s, that what he feared was Genghis Khan with the telegraph. Interpol is the telegraph. The result of the skyrocketing popularity of Interpol systems is that the volume of traffic that Interpol needs to examine in order to ensure compliance with its rules has grown to unmanageable levels. It's obvious that Interpol cannot meaningfully examine 8,000 red notices every single year. And in fact, Interpol has acknowledged that approximately 97% of all notice requests are not reviewed in depth before they're issued. What Interpol does is simply review to make sure that the requesting nation has filled out its own form correctly. Interpol doesn't even require nations to supply an actual arrest warrant for a named individual. All they have to do is say that an arrest warrant exists. In one sense, this is not a bug in the system. It's a feature of the system. After all, Interpol is based, as I mentioned earlier, on the sovereign equality of all of its member nations. So it has no basis for presuming that requests from Russia, for example, are likely to be more abusive than those from Canada. It has no basis for assuming that Iran is likely to be less law-abiding than the United States. When he was interviewed in 2011, Interpol's general counsel put it concisely, quote, "It's really tricky. You receive a request for a notice from a country where human rights are not respected. I would love to have only requests from Switzerland, but the world is not like that," unquote. Well, indeed it is not. In short, if you're a nation that wants to secure a red notice on an individual and you're unscrupulous, all you have to do is tell Interpol that you have a valid arrest warrant, accuse the individual of an offense, and you are quite likely to get a red notice. For the individual, as several of my fellow panelists know far better than I do, the consequences of this sort of politicized abuse can be extremely serious. First of all, nations can choose to have their red notices listed on Interpol's public database. This is one case where openness is not a virtue, because once a red notice goes online, it goes into the world search engines, which will then record that individual as a fugitive from justice. Paradoxically, in this case, abusive nations tend to prefer openness. Legitimate requests are more likely to be kept out of the public side of Interpol's database. And by the way, when you go to Interpol's site and look at the red notices listed, you're only seeing that banks, including U.S. banks, consult to ensure their compliance with Know Your Customer rules enacted after 9/11. The result is that if you're the subject of a red notice, your bank accounts are very likely to be closed, and you will, in fact, be ejected from the U.S. and world financial systems. In short, a red notice, especially a public red notice, prevents you from leading a normal life. And by the way, being an American offers no protection against any of these secondary effects. If you think you're safe because you're not Russian, you are very wrong. While it's true that there are ways of appealing a red notice, the fight is likely to be long, arduous, and unsuccessful. I could say a good deal on this subject, but the basic problem is that Interpol CCF handles the appeals, works slowly, operates on the presumption of national equality, which places the burden of proof on the complainant, and has established no case law, meaning that every complaint has to start from scratch. When you couple all this with the fact that battling Interpol requires expertise that is specialized, rare, and therefore expensive, you arrive at the conclusion that unless the complainant is rich, particularly prominent, or lucky, the red notice is unlikely to be withdrawn. Moreover, even if the complainant wins, Interpol has no reliable mechanism for ensuring that its member nations remove the now discredited red notice from nationally held databases. In other words, even a withdrawn red notice can linger like a ghost in the machine for years. Now, to its credit, Interpol has recently shown some awareness of these concerns, and its new Secretary General, Jürgen Stock from Germany, has shown a far greater willingness to engage with critics than his predecessor, Ron Noble, from the United States. It embarrasses me that the new Secretary General from Germany is better on this than the American, but facts are facts. I'd be willing to say more about what Interpol has done recently in an effort to address some of these concerns, but I fear that the fundamental problem remains. the volume of national requests is simply too large to be examined reliably and with any degree of credibility.